Good afternoon. We'll be starting up in about 4 minutes at 2 o'clock. Good afternoon. We'll be starting up in about 3 minutes at 2 o'clock. Good afternoon. We'll be starting up in about 1 minute. And welcome to those of you who are joining us via Facebook Live. So good afternoon and welcome to our afternoon webinar on Tuesday. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the Cornell Local Roads Program, and hopefully we can get things started. Somebody asked if they had to type in a password. You shouldn't have to if you've registered. That should only be if you're coming in from the outside, so just so you know. Before we get started, there is a spreadsheet we're going to be using some today. Depends on how my Wi-Fi is doing, but right now my Wi-Fi upload speed is actually faster than my download speed, so probably good for you, not great for me. So we should work okay. So we'll be doing that spreadsheet later on the website you can see, but we'll also be posting this where we post the recording for this particular session at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, for those of you who haven't been on one of our sessions before, the chat pod has been disabled, but you can raise your hand. I may even ask you to do that now and then, and please feel free to use the Q&A pod. We do a lot of interaction that way. It works pretty well. And so if you have any questions, and I'll be asking you for some comments, put them in the Q&A pod and we'll follow them on. The session is worth 1 professional development hour for engineers here in New York State. In that particular case, if you need the PDH, it's only the person who is registered who's going to be eligible, and you need to stay on for 90% of the session. And it is also, however, listed as a course, so that's good news. To get that, you're going to need to send us your certificate of attendance, and then we'll check the time that you're on. To get the certificate, you need to be on for about 3/4 of the time, just so you know. If you are from out of state, I see a couple of names of folks who are from out of state. Just so you're aware, to get a PDH in the other state, you'll need to check with your LTAP center to see what the rules are for eligibility in that particular case. Now, before we get started with when to replace your equipment, I'll do a quick poll. So let me bring the poll up here. We're going to launch the polling. Again, helps me figure out who's in the room. 3 questions, so make sure you scroll down and look at all 3 of them. The first one is how many folks are at your site? Then who do you work for? Okay, you can actually click more than one if you really need to. And then how long have you been at your job? So we'll hopefully get 3/4 of you or so to vote. It's all anonymous. We don't care. We're just trying to help us figure out who's in the room. And before we finish that, I do want to give a nice shout out and thank you to Adam Howell and Amanda Link, who are behind the scenes, making sure things run smoothly and helping me with the handling of the question and answers and things like that. Okay, so we're getting pretty close here. Okay, I'll end the polling, share the results. As we've seen with most of these webinars, over half of you are by yourself. Quite a few of you are 10 or more. In fact, we've got more 10 or more than I think we've seen in a while. And that's what you'd sort of expect as we start to open some things back up. Most of you are, again, almost 3/4 are with local government. There's some state and consultant folks in there, a few contractors, and we have 6 honest folks who work for the weekend. Our problem here at the Local Roads Program is we're just not sure what day it is sometimes. And then how long people have been at their jobs, quite a variation, but over half of you have been there greater than 10 years. And again, that helps me as we're going through things. So thank you very much for that. Okay. So when do you replace equipment? Well, we're not going to be talking about a case like this where it's pretty obviously that particular piece of equipment is time to be replaced. Let's talk a little bit more about ones that are more likely like this. You've got a great all or a truck or something that's starting to age, starting to show signs of life. When do you replace? How often do you replace that particular piece of equipment? Okay. Now, all of this starts with your fleet inventory. Okay. If you don't have a good fleet inventory, it's going to be really hard to be able to do some of the tools and some of the techniques that I'm going to show you, but it's really critical. The nice thing about most of our fleets, they're pretty small, and that's good and bad at the same time, but usually we have a pretty good handle on it. So if you do me a favor, I'm going to have you raise your hand. If you have a written down fleet inventory of your equipment, raise your hand. Let's see how many of you raise your hand here. Over half, that's good. So about almost exactly half of you have a written inventory of your equipment, and that's important. And if you don't have one, you may want to put one together. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very simple. You don't have to go out into a lot of details, and I'll give you some examples of how you can use that as you're deciding when to replace your equipment. Now, I asked you for your fleet inventory of the equipment that you've got, but the reality is there's actually more equipment in your fleet than just the pieces of equipment that you own. Because yes, you're going to own the equipment that you use a lot, no doubt about it. That's the fleet inventory. But you're going to borrow a lot of things that you might use infrequently if one of your neighbors, fellow municipalities have it, or you might share some equipment that you just don't have enough of. Get rid of the equipment you don't need. Look back at that fleet inventory. If you've got a crane, for instance, and you haven't used it in 5 years, or maybe you used it once, it's probably time to get rid of that piece of equipment. You just get rid of that equipment. It just takes time to maintain it. If you're not using it, it's probably not your best use of your funds. And then you need to replace the equipment at the optimum time. And we'll talk about what that might be. And there's several different ways to look at that. There's not one answer, one size fits all. So why do we do all this? Why do we care? Well, one of the biggest ones, especially here in the municipal sector, is it reduces the downtime. It's really critical that our equipment works. And especially if you've only got one or maybe two of a particular piece of equipment and it breaks down and you really need it, it could be a problem. Okay, so you want to be able to reduce that downtime. You want to have the right tool for the job. Okay, and we'll give some examples of, and I'm actually going to have you help me with some examples of the wrong tool for the job here in a few minutes. It allows us to be flexible, especially if we've got a good relationship with our neighbors. And of course, we have to deal with emergencies. So in a lot of cases, municipal fleets have items in them that are not in a fleet of, say, a contractor, because we do have to be ready for an emergency situation. So let's talk about the typical fleet. Now, I've got a list. I put together a list of a typical fleet, not the total numbers, because every department is different in size, but what items are in a typical fleet. So if you do me a favor, go over to the Q&A pod, pull it up, drag your mouse down to the bottom, and type in the first piece of equipment that came to your head that you think you should have in your fleet, that everybody has. A pickup truck. Yeah, everybody's got a pickup truck. Yep. Dump truck. Yep. Okay. Loader. Yep. Snow plows. Yep. Graders, excavators. Yep. Backhoes. Chipper. Roadside mowers. Yeah. All kinds of things. Even an air compressor is part of your fleet, even though it may not be rolling equipment. It's still something you might want to take advantage of. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to see if I did a pretty good job here. Let's see what I came up with for my typical fleet here. Okay. So pickup, hey, I got that, good. Dump truck, okay. Could be a 6-wheeler or a 10-wheeler, could be a specialized truck. Grader, most agencies own graders. In fact, this is something I just, again, raise your hand if your municipality owns a grader. About half of you are listing that, though when we've gone around and we've talked with people, usually for most towns and counties, they own a grader, and a lot of villages do as well. Okay, a roller. Might be different sizes. A lot of them own 2 or 3. Some own sheepfoot, some own steel drums, so different ones. Excavator of some type, could be a backhoe, it could be a track excavator. A loader, one of the most common tools in the fleet. Some kind of trailer to carry equipment and supplies, usually pulled by a dump truck, but sometimes some agencies actually own their own tractor just to pull them around. Snow plow, okay, that goes in the front of the dump truck, usually, or a pickup. Spreader, generally if you got a snow plow, you probably got a spreader with it, but not in every case. Mower, we had that listed. Broom, and a rake, okay? Now, you may not own all of these items, and of course you're going to have different quantities, but you start with the things in the typical fleet. Now, does anybody think that they need more of, say, for instance, dump trucks? Do you have enough dump trucks in your fleet? What do you think? You could either put it in the QA, or if you think you don't have enough, raise your hand. Yeah, not usually. Somebody says yes, okay. Okay, so if some people say yes, actually quite a few. That's good. This leads into my question. I'm going to go do chip sealing, okay? I'm going to chip seal a road, and I want to chip seal a 5-mile stretch of highway. And it's about, 4 or 5 miles from the garage. How many trucks would you like to have for your chip seal operation? Dump trucks to haul stone. Somebody said 4, one said 2. Someone said 10, 7. It depends on your operations. Okay, for those who said 7 and 10, do you have 7 or 10 dump trucks? Let's just see. What did they say? Oh, they didn't say it. Nope, they don't. So if you don't have enough trucks in your typical fleet, how can you overcome that? Depends how fast you drive. Yeah, that's true. You could use shared services. Yeah, that's actually, or you could rent them. There's different ways to do that. And we're going to go through a few of those, but that also changes when you're going to be replacing your equipment. Okay, so you could rent short term or share, okay, those activities. Okay. Now let's go back and look at our list of extra equipment. These are things that, as we've gone around, we see a lot of agencies own. Lowboys to carry large pieces of equipment, sometimes that's shared. Stake trucks, though some municipalities own lots of them. Chippers for spreading stone, pavers, shoulder widening, bulldozers, and specialized backhoes. It's always an issue. Now here's a point in the Q&A pod, which is a good one. Trucks are not the problem. People to drive them is. Okay? And that's true. That's a good point. Okay? Somebody said they didn't see a sweeper, by the way. We do have a broom on the page before. Some agencies have a separate sweeper. Some do a hookup broom. But yes, good point. It really comes down to developing a list of what equipment you need to have. And yes, finding personnel to drive it is something, but that's a talk for a different webinar or a different class as we move into the future. Okay? But it really does help to work together on these activities. So what are your options to borrow or have that extra equipment available? Well, people have already listed it. The first one, a lot of agencies will rent the piece of equipment. In a lot of cases, they could rent it with or without the operator. That could reduce the total number of pieces of equipment you've got. So you need to decide what is your minimum. Is it designed around snow plowing or summer work, things like that? Okay. Do you need a vac truck? Okay. And do you need a brush chipper? Okay. So yeah, these are all different things that you might need to have. You can share or borrow with your neighbors. That's a very commonly done thing. In fact, one of my favorite things to see people do, because it stretches our dollars and allows us to have more equipment available where we share back and forth. Okay. Ah, yes, I see somebody from a city has put in, they've got to have a paint truck and a water truck and a flusher. Yeah, you need to make a list of what you've got to have in your fleet. You could have a contract. A lot of contracts are available to rent the equipment, again, with or without an operator. Now, how's that different than rental? Usually in a contract, it's for a limited operation or a specialized piece of equipment versus rental long-term where you use it over a whole longer period of time. It's still a form of a contract, okay? So there's lots of options that are available to us. So keep that in mind as you're developing your fleet. Now, why does equipment fail? Well, there's lots of reasons equipment fails. Some of them, it's not failing prematurely, but we care about that. But there's reasons equipment fail. One is accidents. If we have an accident, that's an issue. Obviously, we could have the wrong equipment. You use the wrong equipment, you're going to damage what you shouldn't be using in that particular operation, and it could be a problem. You could overwork your equipment. You could do lack of maintenance. You could use the equipment improperly, okay? And of course, age makes a difference. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go through each of these 6 items, and I want you to, if you've got an example where that's happened, type it into the Q&A pod just so we can see that this is not uncommon, any of these. So who has had an accident that's either destroyed or damaged a piece of equipment that caused it to either fail completely or fail prematurely? Like in this case, they hit a gas line. Okay, so give me an example, not yes. So you had an accident? Yeah, crashes are probably the single most common thing that happens. You back into another vehicle, you could hit something else, you hit a gas line that was improperly marked. All kinds of accidents and crashes can occur. So this is actually one of the hardest parts about developing a long-term plan, because that crash or accident or fire changes the whole plan. So one thing I always make sure people remember, make sure your insurance is paid up and you know what is your deductible, okay? What is it that you really can afford to replace, okay? We do a work zone package. I was just actually talking with some folks about the paperwork with last year's. And most agencies, their work zone, their deductible for their insurance is several $1,000s. And you lose some small pieces of equipment like work zone signage, you're not going to get it replaced. So know what your insurance is, okay? And try to work on avoiding those crashes and accidents. We actually have a webinar on that in 2 weeks. I'll let you know about it at the end. Next one is the wrong equipment for the job, okay? Now, I show cartoon of a screwdriver because that's one that we've all used. A screwdriver is either a hammer or a chisel. But do you have an example where you've used a piece of equipment in quote unquote the wrong way, where you probably knew better, but you went ahead and did it anyway? And I'm not talking about a screwdriver. I'm talking about a truck or a backhoe or a grader. Any examples there? Nobody's brave enough today. Well, that's good if you've never had one. That's good. I'm glad to hear somebody saying they've not done that. But we've all seen examples of that where someone has tried to use a backhoe to compact earth. Or you try to pull one truck out, you really didn't have the right truck to use as a tow truck. Yeah. Make sure you use the equipment for the job properly. You don't want to damage it. That reduces its life. You don't want to overwork the equipment and overload it, okay? If you've got a, let's see here, we've got an example. Loader is a forklift, yep. Use a screwdriver to replace a missing bolt. That's crazy. Yeah, okay, I suppose it would work till it shears. But you could overwork your piece of equipment. If you've got a 2-horsepower towing vehicle, that's what this is, you don't want to be trying to pull more than the equipment can handle because it's going to be, frankly, damaged. In this case, it's not going to last as long. It's not going to work as hard, okay? So you want to make sure you don't overwork. What is the upper limit? What is the maximum amount you can carry, for instance, on your 10-wheelers or your 6-wheelers? Yeah, it's nice to be able to carry that extra load, but that extra load will damage the springs, will damage the bolts, and then you'll get your screwdriver out to fix it. That's probably not going to be happy. You've got to do the maintenance. Like it or not, we all know this. It happens in the world of roads. It happens in the world of equipment as well. We want to cut the maintenance because that seems like a good short-term fix. Though I'm a fan actually going the other direction. If I have to cut something, I'm going to cut the capital stuff. The maintenance has to be kept up. You got to paint the house, which I need to do on mine. You got to change the oil, okay? You got to use the equipment properly. This is actually a picture of Bill Mobbs. If you remember, Bill Mobbs is here in Tompkins County. It's one in his slide deck. And essentially, the guy was going a little too fast and wound up going over into a ditch and pretty much destroyed the equipment. So now it's a crash, but he wasn't using it properly. The real problem wasn't that he crashed. The real problem was he was going too fast. So when he did lose control, he was going to crash badly and destroy the piece of equipment, okay? So make sure you know how to operate things properly. You don't want to have somebody, for instance, who doesn't know that lever A picks up the back of the dump truck, and lever B is the one that actually turns on the spinner, okay? Truck looks obsolete? Yeah, this is a picture Bill Mobbs took when he worked in Africa decades ago. So it's actually an old slide of his. So, and then of course, age. Now, truth be told, if you maintain it, you've got some pretty good age in some of our equipment if you can maintain it. So I'm just curious, of the 80 folks or so who are on there, what's the oldest dump truck in your fleet? It's an active dump truck, not one that sits out with the nice paint on it, but it's actually being used on at least a semi-regular basis. 84, 2008, 20 years old. 2005 Sterling. So 1988, I think that's our winner. At 88, there's an 88 Ford, so it's 288 in here. Yeah, that's pretty good, okay? But you can't get there if you don't do the maintenance, if you overwork the equipment, if you use it improperly. You've really got to take care of it. The bottom line is pretty simple. Money. We know that. That's what it comes down to. And what I want to talk about a little bit is, frankly, is the life cycle cost of the piece of equipment. Because that's really what we're thinking about when it comes to when to replace it. Now, the life cycle cost includes all kinds of different costs. It includes the initial cost, it includes the operation and the maintenance cost, and possibly salvage cost. A lot of agencies actually purposely take their equipment to auction to get a salvage value out of it. And you can account for all of that in your life cycle, okay? Now, the first one is the initial cost. You get what you pay for. Has anybody ever bought a piece of equipment that we already saw a couple examples in the Q&A that were just a little bit too small or didn't quite do what you wanted them to do? Yeah, that's fairly common. But has anybody ever purchased a piece of equipment not using low bid, but total life cost? Has anybody ever done that? Raise your hand if you have. I'm gonna, yep, okay, we've got one or two people that have, okay? Cool. You need to write a separate bid to do that. It's got to be part of the bid process. You can actually do that, where you include the maintenance cost or expected maintenance cost. You include even possibly the salvage cost, and you can actually get the lowest total cost in that particular case. But you get what you pay for. So that's why specs are so important. You want to get the right piece of equipment for the job, okay? You need to make sure that you pay for operations. What do I mean by operational costs? What do you think I include when I'm talking about operational costs or operations in a piece of equipment? Efficiency, yeah, but what am I paying for? Look, hourly costs to run the piece. So what do I got to pay for? Yeah, fuel, maintenance supplies, tires, windshield wipers, brakes, possibly repairs and fuels, okay? Generally, the two types of things we deal with, operational are things we're using on a day-to-day basis. So that's the gas, okay? That's the tires, the fuel, oil, things like that. Those are operational costs, okay, that you're running when you're outside of the shop area versus maintenance costs. These are the costs when they're at the facility, okay? So that's the cost of doing the repairs. So does a windshield wiper count as a maintenance cost or does it count as an operational cost? Well, normally we throw that in operational cost because, again, you're using it out in the field. So that's a good way to think about it. Now, before I get into other maintenance costs, I don't want to forget about storage. Why is storage an important part of the maintenance decisions that we're going to make on a piece of equipment? Why is storage important? It can add or subtract from life. It slows the aging. Yeah, absolutely. But facilities do cost money, and so you have to balance those two, but it's part of the overall equation. That's why it's really sometimes hard to separate those things out, but storage can make a huge difference. So keep that in mind. It can certainly last a lot longer. Now, there's preventive maintenance that we have to do. That's changing the oil, changing the fluids, even painting the truck, cleaning it on a regular basis. Preventive maintenance, they'll make it last longer versus routine maintenance, okay? Routine maintenance is sometimes very similar to preventive. In fact, there's a lot of overlap. But routine maintenance are things like replacing hoses on a regular basis, okay? Doing some things before you're having to prevent a problem. Very much like on a roadway, there's a balancing act that has to be done for all of these things. What we really want to have is we want to avoid the worst type, and that is unplanned maintenance, okay? So if I wanted to rebuild an engine, okay, would that be routine, preventative, or unplanned maintenance? Rebuilding an engine, what do you think? Let's see what people think. Routine. Unplanned, depends on why, unplanned. If you have to rebuild it because it wasn't scheduled, yeah, it's an unplanned maintenance activity. But if you think about it, you could actually schedule the rebuilding of that engine, depending on why it's happening, the why and the how, okay? You could actually plan on doing that, okay? Does it currently run? Well, obviously, if it doesn't run, you're going to have to rebuild it. But if you can produce a plan, you might actually be thinking about maybe doing some of those things ahead of time. Maybe it's part of a routine process. Maybe there's some things you could look for to rebuild it before it stops working and the damage that you occur in that case, okay? Now, salvage, we don't want to forget about salvage. Yeah, a good point before I move on to salvage. Contractors plan to rebuild engines in the winter. Yeah, when you rebuild it matters. Salvage is a pretty important part of our overall plan. You can account for it, so keep that in mind. If you get rid of it a little sooner, you might get some money back. I know of municipalities around New York State, for instance, who get items off of the state bid system, and they, my computer decided to go backwards, and they decided to get money back. And they buy every year or every 2 years, they buy a brand new pickup, and they sell it on salvage, and their cost becomes mostly operational. The state DOT routinely sells old equipment, and they do it at auction, okay? Does anybody here on today's call, for instance, does anybody do that, where you buy a pickup and you resell it after just 1 or 2 years? Raise your hand if you do. Yep, 1, 2, so a couple of you do. It's actually a pretty cool technique. Now, you have to account for the operations. You can't bond it. That's a good point someone makes, okay? But if you do it right, you almost create yourself a operational cost situation, okay? Now, someone asked in the Q&A, do people lease equipment? How many folks lease equipment on a regular basis? We'll see how many folks raise your hand. Huh, nobody raising their hand today. So some agents up, no, here we go, 4 or 5, yep. And some lease to own, yeah, so something to think about. The goal here is to minimize that life cycle cost. So if you look at it, if we have a piece of equipment that costs $25,000 to start, it might not cost that much to run it, okay? And maybe it's actually pretty small at start, but over time, the maintenance starts to get more and more expensive. And so after 10 years, the maintenance costs start to make it cost even more than we'd like. And then the 10th year, we're going to get rid of it. So we don't put much money into the maintenance. We let it deteriorate, but we sell it for salvage, and we have an annual cost. Okay, this is a nice theoretical. You can annualize this, and some people will do that. So they'll take the initial and salvage costs, they'll combine them together, and they'll average them all out over the life, in this case, 10 years. And you can really quickly see the cost of the operations and the maintenance. Now you'll notice I did not include inflation, okay? Yeah, I understand that. I a lot of times like to actually do the calculations without including inflation to start with, and then I can always put inflation back into the equations later on. Yes, inflation is important. If you're going to deal with cost increases, it's pretty important. And from a budgeting standpoint, you probably need to include some work on inflation. But there are ways to overcome that. Maybe let your inflation work with the budget, okay? Explaining it to people with inflation can be a bit of a challenge. I'll show you that here before the end of the session. Now, these nice charts, this is what we show, you know, all the classes show this classically in economic theory and all that fun stuff. That's not the real world. The real world is not nice and neat, okay? The real world, the O&M numbers are going to go up and down. You know, yes, the operations costs, the fuel mileage costs are pretty constant, though they might slowly go up over time. But it's the maintenance cost, and there's not an even pattern to this. So maybe early on you had to do replace some tubes or replace some of the circuits that just weren't working. The wires were having problems, but everything stabilized. But in 6 or 7, now you're starting to see big engine problems get more expensive. At some point, it would be cheaper to just go ahead and replace that piece of equipment. And so that comes back to when to replace. Okay, so I'm going to give you some techniques for when to replace your equipment. Which one's the best one? I'm actually a fan of trying to look at all of them, but you can use the ones that's best for your particular operation. You can use depreciation and total cost, and we'll come back to each of these in a little more detail. You can look at historical analysis if you've got time, you've got numbers, and that can be one of the challenges is having good numbers. You can develop a cyclic replacement plan, which is a great way to at least develop what you'd like to do and then let the other factors sort of figure out what's exactly happening year to year. And keep in mind, whenever you're doing this, what are your critical needs? What are the operations you absolutely have to be able to do? So maybe you replace a piece of equipment a little bit sooner. So let's walk through each of these 4. So the concept of depreciation and total cost is like this. It's just an example. And by the way, this is for the entire, not so much fleet, but all the vehicles or all the pieces of equipment that are of the same type, all your trucks, all your buses for a school bus garage, hard to sometimes do this with a single piece of equipment. But if you look at it, there's going to be a fixed cost. That's the initial cost and some depreciation value on that initial cost, the fixed cost. And that slowly goes down over time as we depreciate, as it, ages. There's also going to be the repair cost, which again, in the nice theoretical world, it tends to go up, okay? What's cool about this is if you look at the whole fleet, if that actually turns out to be pretty true, if you combined all of your fleet together by age, and you can actually find the total cost is somewhere, starts off pretty high. As you own the piece of equipment, it gets less and less expensive. At some point on average age, the cost of the repairs exceed the cost of ownership. That's theoretically the best time to replace it. And again, the real world's not nice and neat like this, but you can track it, okay, and look at it and start to do a historical analysis. So that's one of the reasons I like to actually do the annualization, because if you annualize it out, you sort of say, well, look, yes, theoretically I should depreciate this, but let's just take the initial cost and average it over what I'd like to see for lifespan. Then I can start looking at just the O&M cost. And when my O&M cost, my operations and maintenance cost, starts to consistently exceed the annual average cost, it's a good time to think about replacing it, okay? So in this particular case, my initial and salvage cost, I took salvage out just to keep it simple. I assume no salvage in this case. Up to year 5, no problem, okay? Yeah, it's about 6 or 7 years where it starts to get too high, okay? So when you start seeing operations and maintenance costs exceeding the annual cost, that's a good time to think about replacing that particular piece of equipment. I'll tell you right now, a lot of trucks will be longer than that, but just as a way to look at this particular operations, but you do have to track those data, okay? This is actual data. Again, Bill Mobbs did this work when he was with Tompkins County. He actually had, in this particular case, 4 pieces of equipment, okay? So we have trucks 41, 42, 49, and 50, okay? So of those 4 trucks, truck 50 started off for its first 4 years in pretty good shape, and then all of a sudden it spiked up. Now, it was covered under warranty, but they had to spend $23,000 in warranty work, and they had actually calculated their cost per mile. They went back and calculated cost per mile as opposed to hours. I know some agencies use hours. But you can see it spiked in those couple of years, including the cost of the warranty work, okay? Truck 49, it spiked even more, up above 80 cents per mile for a couple of years, and then came back down some. Truck 42, pretty good for its first 5 years, and a little bit up and down with looking at the data. And then 41 started going up in about year 7 or year 8. So of those 4 trucks, which one would you think got replaced first and why? Which one got replaced first and why? Truck 49, because it's such a huge spike that even with the warranty work, too much downtime, very high cost. Yep. So truck 49 was one that, yeah, the price started to come back down some, but it just got too expensive to maintain it. So even though they kept it for a couple of more years, it never really came all the way back down. That was first. What do you think was the other piece of equipment that wound up getting replaced? What was second on the list? And by the way, just so you know, 50 came back down into this range here somewhere. I don't know exactly where, okay? It was actually 41. In the case of 41, rather than being warranty work, it started to just get more expensive, even though there's no evidence. There was no damage. There was nothing that they could see, okay? One of the good points was, was the driver or the route for the truck part of the issue? It's possible. It's always possible. Maybe you've got a particular truck route that's much harder on the trucks. You're going up and down a lot more steep hills. So be careful when you run these analyses. Look carefully at what you're putting on the truck or the piece of equipment. Again, we talked about overloading it. That could be part of the issue as well. Assuming consistent work, you could look for something like this. So what I want to do now is, if you can start developing those plans for when to replace the equipment, add a cyclic replacement plan on top of it, and you can use those two together to develop an overall capital plan. Now, the formula for that is pretty simple. How much money do you need to have in your budget? Well, if you know the cost of something brand new, divide it by its life times how many of them you own, that's how much money you need to have, okay? So let's just do this, we'll do this little fun here. How much is a brand new dump truck? And I don't care 6 or 10, whatever you're using. What's a brand new dump truck cost you right now? 180, and I'm going to make a gut assumption that that's $180,000, right? Okay. So we'll go $180,000. Okay. So if I got a truck that cost $180,000, how long are you going to keep that truck? How long would you like to keep that truck? 220 years? That's a really good truck life. 10 years, 12 years. Again, the nice thing is you can do any number you want. I'm going to use 12 years because I got a calculator over here. I can use a calculator. Okay. So now I grab my little calculator. I turn it on and I type in 180,000 and I divide it by 12. And that means I need $15,000 per year per truck. So how many trucks in your fleet? How many trucks are in your fleet? 5. So if I've got 5 trucks, okay, that's $75,000 or $75,000 per year just to replace your trucks. Okay, and if you have what one person put in the Q&A pod, 33 trucks in your fleet because you're a large operation, you're going to have a little bit more money. And yet we've gone around and we've seen agencies that have a 0 capital replacement plan. That's not good. Now, I know some of you are going, but Dave, there's inflation. Okay, there's the equation, okay? You can write the equation down. It's available on our website, okay? You can do that. In fact, let's see if my little thing works here. We have a spreadsheet. Again, it's on our website. We'll link to it with the webinar recording being in the same place. We have a place where you can put in all of your equipment, put in all your lifespans, how many of them you own, and it'll do all the calculations for you. You fill in the stuff to the left in the yellow area, and it calculates the rest, okay? And I'll come back to that depending on how much time we have. And if you're wondering, yes, we do. We have the same thing for inflation as well, okay? So that's the budget needs spreadsheet that I mentioned. So just let's look as an example. Let's say that we develop a cyclic replacement plan. We'd like to replace our pickup every 5 years, our dump truck every 10 years, our loader every 15 years, and so on and so on. You can develop a plan using that says, I'm going to replace my pickups every 5 years. And yes, this is an old set of slide. I didn't bother updating the dates. But so we take the pickup replacement here, and we replace it again 5 years later, okay? We replace a dump truck here. Now, you'll notice I've got another dump truck here, and I've got another dump truck here, 3 years apart, and yet I said I kept them for 10 years. Why do you think my cyclic replacement plan has me replacing one every 3 years or so? If I keep the dump trucks for 10 years, why would I need to replace one every 3 years? Multiple trucks, exactly. You got multiple trucks, you're going to have a replacement plan in place, okay? So if you owned 3 trucks and replace them every 10 years, on average, you'd have to stagger that fleet out, okay? It would spread out the cost and actually be a little bit more efficient. And that means you have some new versus some old piece of equipment. Because if you buy them all at the same time, they're all going to wear out at the same time. Okay, so you can use this cyclic concept to develop a replacement plan. Now, That's assuming nice even numbers. But when you start doing the math, you're going to be like, but wait a second, the cost of everything, okay? So I got a small tractor and I've got a dump truck and I've got a pickup. That's this cost in 2002 or whatever year. We can make that 2022. What the heck, we'll make it. We can change it on the fly. Okay? But the next year's cyclic plan, I only need about $90,000 and so on. Well, how am I going to overcome this problem? The fact that if I've got a cyclic replacement plan, the average is probably going to be about $70,000 a year. Okay? How do I overcome the fact that in some years I need more than twice that amount, and some years I need less? How do I overcome that? I can't really develop a cyclic replacement plan in this particular case because it's really hard to buy half of a pickup truck. You could borrow money, you could lengthen the replacement cycles, okay? But of course, if you lengthen it, then you're going to have more maintenance costs, so that's that balancing act. Ah, yes, there's a couple of people got it. You can have a capital equipment or reserve fund, okay? So what you do is you put money in the bank, okay? Now, where that line needs to be, what happens is in the years when you're below the amount of money that's the average, okay? And now that I'm looking at it, I think the average is 80,000. Now my brain is remembering this. But I take the money that I didn't spend in one year and I put it in my cyclic reserve, okay? So what that does is in years when I'm over the average, I've got money, okay? Now you have to develop this. You have to appropriate those funds. In fact, you need to set up the account for that because once that account is set up, the money shouldn't be used for other things. It should be used for the equipment, okay? But that's a way to average out those costs. In that particular case, even though I'm showing it to you without the inflation number in there, you've got to include inflation in your calculations. It's absolutely critical, okay? Because if you don't, you're going to start running short as inflation occurs over time. We've been really lucky with low inflation, but even a 1 or 2% over time can add up quite a bit. In fact, I'll show you that here before we get done. Now, raise your hand if your agency has an equipment reserve or replacement fund. 1, 3, 5. Yeah, quite a few of you do. Yeah. Absolutely vital to have one of those. It's your rainy day fund in some respects, but it's more important. It allows you that cyclic replacement time, okay? And so all of this together allows us to put together a full capital equipment plan. So we developed the cyclic replacement concept to figure out how long we want to keep a particular piece of equipment. We use good information to track maybe a piece of equipment that's a lemon. We all get those, okay? And we should have developed a plan. We know that. Okay, things change. There's no perfect solution, but you develop this plan and you can adjust it back and forth. And it really does work pretty well. Is it perfect? No, but it gets us in the ballpark so we're not scrambling at the last minute if something happens, okay? So what I want to do is go through a couple of examples of that, and then we'll go back to the spreadsheet. We've got plenty of time to do that. So let's go back. We're going to look at our stake truck, okay? Now this happens to be a private company who owns it, but it doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's pretty easy. You take the unit replacement cost, divide it by the life expectancy, times the total, and that's your average replacement cost that you need annually, okay? And then, of course, you need 3 of them, say, so that's $15,000 per year. It's pretty easy, okay? That same equation, by the way. So we can do the same thing with a roller, okay? So how much does a brand new roller cost? Does anybody know? How much does a roller cost? People haven't bought a roller in a while. 125,000, 60,000. Again, depends on the size. Are you in a city environment, like a couple of you I noticed? Are you in a rural area? Are you getting a large steel drum? Is it a sheep's foot? There's all kinds of things. That's the great thing about this. you can put in, bought two of them, a 2-ton for 18K. That's pretty cool. The whole point is you'll put in the actual replacement cost. And even if you've got a piece of equipment that's old and you've had it for a long time, you can still sort of use current cost to figure out how much money you have probably invested in that particular piece of equipment, okay? So you just run the same numbers, okay? And you could do that for everything in your fleet, okay? It works pretty well. So you just would calculate the cost of everything in your fleet and you'd add it all up, okay? Now, if you only own one of each of these items, you'd only need $40,000. The chances you're only owning one are pretty small. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go back over to, actually move my slide so I don't forget. So I'm going to go back over here, and I have an example that I put in, and this is available in the spreadsheet. We purposely put this in here. So I have my example, and I'm going to blow that up slightly so we can see it, because I know even on small screens, it's pretty hard to see. Okay, so we've already heard truck price. I'm not probably too far off with $180,000 for a truck. How much is a loader these days? Anybody, how much is a loader? I don't think it's $108,000 anymore. Last time I looked. Yeah, 245. I'll use 245. Okay. How much is a brand new grader? I'm going to assume 4-wheel drive or all-wheel drive if you got a 6-wheel grader. I see Mr. Payne on there. He's drooling. He wants one of these, I know. 310. Okay. Backhoe excavator. We'll assume a relatively small one, not the real big monsters. Nobody has bought one of those. 110. I'll leave it at 180. 160. I'll do 160, sure. Again, depends on the size. Pickup trucks. How much is a pickup truck? $35,000, sure. And then, great point somebody raised. Does that include the plow or not? Okay. The way I think about that is whether I'm going to include them or not is, do they have the same lifespan? If they're going to have the same lifespan, you can do them all as a unit. But if they're going to be separate lifespans, they're going to overlap, you probably want to track them separately. So in this case, you'll see, for instance, the sander plow is listed separately because the assumption was that while the trucks might get purchased, and you might buy a brand new sander plow at that time, you might have to do replacements on a slightly different cycle. Okay. So how much is a sander and plow setup for a dump truck these days on top of the 180,000? I know it's more than 25. Well, we'll leave it at 25 for the, oh, here we go, 80,000, 35,000. I'll split the difference. I'll go 55 just for the sake of having a number. And then a roller, I've got it $40,000 in it, just as an example. So now what I want to do is I want to go back through, and I usually start with the lifespan I'd like to have, not the lifespan that I probably can afford, the lifespan I'd like to have. So let's quickly go through and tell me what lifespans you'd like to have for, well, starting with your dump trucks. So how long do you want your life, what would you like for your lifespan of your dump truck? 12 years, got it. Loader? $15 years, 20 years, we'll go 15. Okay, we'll clear all those. We're going to go down to grader. $30, $25, $20, $10, $15. I'll go with 25 just for the sake of argument. Backhoe excavator. 10, 20, 15. Okay, we'll go with 15. That's sort of a nice middle zone. Pickup trucks. 6, 4, 10. I'm going to leave it at 7 then, just for the sake of numbers. Sander and plow, 5, 20, quite a range there. I'll go with 8, just as a sort of a quick number in my head, and then roller. 15, 15. Okay, we got a bunch of 15s. We'll go with 15. Okay. So I usually start with what I've got. And then again, it all calculates out, and I need $177,000 set up without inflation. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to purposely copy the values here. I'm going to come over to my sheet that has that lovely inflation factor in it. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I want to illustrate to you the cost of money. There we go. Okay. I'm assuming only a 2% interest rate. Okay. But with a 2% interest rate, there's an additional cost of holding that money. Okay. Things get more expensive over time. And at just a 2% inflation rate, I jump up to about $190,000 that I would need on an annual basis. Okay. So when you do these calculations, I like to start without inflation, but you probably need to think about including it at the end of the day, especially if you're developing an equipment replacement fund. Okay, 177,775. Okay, I probably should round that number, but now that's what I'd like to have. But let's say I've only got 150,000. What am I going to do? And yes, you might use different rates for motor vehicles versus equipment. Are you going to use years, lives, hours? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you probably have a different spreadsheet for your motor vehicles than you would for the rest of your equipment fleet that's hour-based. Yeah. So how would you get that down to 150,000? Let's say that's all the money you're going to be able to get out of the board. You know you can't get. You could extend your life cycle. Yep. Okay. You could do, that's one way to do it, okay? In fact, most of the time, that's one of the most common ways we do it, increase the lifespan. But remember, going back to the initial slides, if you go too far, the cost goes up on the maintenance side, okay? So you have to balance those two back and forth, okay? So keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, I'm gonna go, yep, you'll run the risk of running over the O&M budget. So what I wanna do though is a great thing sitting in the Q&A pod that I didn't want to forget about. And that is, what do we use for the inflation factor? A lot of people like to use the CPI. I actually like the CPI. I think the CPI is a pretty good tool, Consumer Price Index. However, it doesn't track how we spend money in the construction industry. So what we probably should be thinking about using is something called the PPI, Producer Price Index. The challenge, of course, is there's about 500 of them out there for what is the right producer price index. So I usually look at the gravel industry or the construction industry PPI numbers. They're pretty good. They haven't varied too much from the CPI lately, but in some industries, they're much higher. So there's something to keep in mind. And of course, then you got to convince the board to be involved in that as well. But again, goes back to developing a long-range plan, dealing with accidents, dealing with maintenance, watching for those limits. Because at the end of the day, we really want to have a good capital equipment plan. Now, you'll notice I haven't talked about one subject yet. Okay? We're going to be brave here. We'll see if my video shows. Probably can't hear the sound, but as you develop your plan, do me a favor. Think about the downtime and the critical needs, okay? Think about those pieces of equipment that are really critical in your system. And if for some reason you didn't have them, you might have a problem later on, okay? What is your safety equipment, your PPE, things like that. So last question for you to fill into the Q&A pod. Do you have a piece of equipment in your fleet that you only own one of, that if it breaks down, it shuts down your operations? Do you have an example of that? Yes. Okay. Smart guy. Paver, water truck, sweeper. Yep. Sewer jet, fuel truck. Yeah. So you've got some choices at that point. If you can't run the job without that particular piece of equipment, that loader, that grader, you need to think about either making sure you can borrow from somebody else. And oh, by the way, they're probably using their grader or their specialized piece of equipment at that point. The highway superintendent, that's a really hard one to replace. Okay. And I'm not getting into that cycle. But you might want to make that one have a shorter lifespan. Prioritize around those specialized pieces of equipment that you can't stretch. So when you're developing your plan, don't try to stretch the lives of those and maybe even go a little bit sooner. Because if they break down, now you have yourself a problem because they're a critical need, especially in the world of the municipal sector where we got to plow, we got to deal with floods, and we got to deal with emergencies. Okay? We got 2 or 3 minutes. Any questions? Anything? Yep, you could get a 2-year trade-in. A 2-year trade on the highway superintendent is tough. I like the 4-year version, but that's just me. Any questions, comments? Otherwise, I want to thank everybody. And I want to remind you of our next webinars that are coming up. Next, we have bumper banters. We're going to continue them, at least for the foreseeable future, to give you updates. We'll probably drop to every couple of weeks, those starting in pretty soon. Next week's webinar is on thickness of design of low volume pavements. We're doing a safety starting at the tailgate, and I do need your help for the last week of June and July. We're going to be at least running webinars through the summer and go from there. So let me see, any questions? Oh, I got a question. Can a meticulous maintenance plan outweigh purchasing new equipment? Yes, a good quality maintenance plan can make a huge difference. Okay, but you got to make sure you've got good people, good mechanics. They've got to have good equipment, and you got to put the time and effort to maintain that properly. That's how you get those 70-year-old trucks that still work, or the 1988 trucks that still work, by good maintenance. But don't shortchange and don't skimp. Okay. Any other questions? If not, it's just about 3 o'clock, and I'll give you back 1 minute of your day. Hopefully, you're not too hot outside for you. Get outside, enjoy the day, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.